In this video, we're going to look at integrating our Airtable data into our Next.js application by using the Context API. Now, if you want to follow along with the entire series, make sure to go and check out part 1. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and get started. So now what we'll do is inside of our components directory, we will create a to-do component. And I'll stub this out with my RFC snippet again. Again, you can type that out if you need to, no worries. And what this function will do is accept a parameter or a property of to-do. And then we want to go ahead and display that thing. So we could start by just writing out the description in here. So we could have a p tag and we could say to-do.fields.description and make sure these are inside of brackets. All right, so that looks like it'll be okay. And then inside of our index.js page, now we can take all of our to-dos and we can map through them to display them. So we'll say initial to-dos.map. We'll get a reference to each to-do. And then what we'll return is that component that we just created. So we'll do a to-do component. And again, I've got an auto import. If you don't have that, make sure to go up and import that thing from your to-do component. And for each one of these, we'll need a unique key. So we can actually grab the to-do ID. And then we will pass in the to-do as a property to this component. And then we can just do a self-closing tag there. So we're iterating through each one of these to-dos, and then we're displaying it with this to-do component. So if we come back now, at least we should be able to see here are each of the different to-dos along with this title here. All right, but now we need to update these a bit to make sure that we're able to display the checkbox to be able to toggle that thing as completed. We want to also maybe add a line through the text if it is completed. We want to show the description, which we're already doing, and then we'll want to add a delete button as well. So let's start to break these out. Let's actually wrap these in a UL in here. And then what we'll do is each one of these to-dos will become an LI. So this will be an LI here. And inside of this LI, we're going to have, in addition to the text that we just put there, we're going to have an input of type checkbox. Now, again, I'm getting some IntelliSense in here with VS Code for emit abbreviation. So that's going to go ahead and complete that thing for me. And we'll just call this a completed for the name and ID. And then we'll say checked is going to be to-do.fields.completed. All right, so that's going to decide whether or not that thing is checked. And then we'll go ahead, actually, let's save this. Let's just see what this looks like. So we should see there's the checkbox for each one of these. Okay, it doesn't look that great. One of the things that we could do is start to add some styling to our LI. And so one of the things is we'll go ahead and add a background of white. We'll add a flex here. So this will align things horizontally, as you can tell now. And then we'll say item center. We'll center those things vertically. And the more you get used to these Tailwind classes, the more you'll get used to them. We will add a shadow large. So you'll start to see this will have a little bit of a shadow there. All right. We will say rounded large. And then we'll give it a little bit of margin. So we'll give it some vertical margin as well as some padding vertically and some padding horizontally. So PX-4. So now we're able to start to see these a little bit. So that's starting to look pretty good, or at least a little bit close. One thing we can do is add a little bit of classes to this checkbox. So let's grab the checkbox and let's add some margin right. So MR2. And then there's a form checkbox inside of Tailwind that we can use, and we can manually set the height and width with the H-5 and the W-5. And now this is starting to look pretty close. So the one other piece that we want to do is if this thing is completed, we want to go ahead and strike through the actual text there. So I'm going to make this or add class name to this, and we'll add some classes. So we'll say this is going to be a flex 1, which means we want this thing to take up as much space as it can. We'll see why in a second. Then we'll change the color on here to text gray 800. And then what I want to do is conditionally add a class of line through, because I only want to add this line through class if the thing is actually checked, which this one is not. So the way we can do that is we can make this, basically write some JavaScript in here, and we'll use ES6 template literal string. So this right here would be the exact same, but now we want to wrap this and use some sort of variable to determine whether or not we want to add this. So we'll take our todos.fields.completed, and we'll use a ternary here. So if that thing is true, we will add this line through class. Otherwise, we will add nothing. So what we should see is only the ones that are completed will get this line through. And it looks like this should not be to-dos, but just to do there. So now that looks like it's updating appropriately. So that's pretty cool. And then we can also go down and add our button, and this will be for deleting this thing. So we'll add a button, and we're going to add a couple of different properties in here. So we'll have a type of button. And then really what we'll have is a lot of classes with Tailwind. So we'll kind of talk through those as well. So we'll add text small. This will just kind of make the text a little bit small in general. We'll make sure we have not delete, but delete in here. So we'll have text small. We'll have a background red of 500. We'll have a hover background red of 600. So again, darkening that color when we hover. We'll set the text to white. We'll have PY1, so a vertical padding of 1, and then a horizontal padding of 2. Then we'll use the rounded class. This will give it the rounded edges. And if we save this, we should see pretty close to what we're expecting. So it's got the hover effect here. And if we click on this, nothing is happening now because we need to add the event handlers, but we at least have the layout that we're looking for. And we have the ability not necessarily to be able to toggle these things on and off. And the only reason is we need to be able to update this thing, and we haven't yet, but we at least have the look and feel that we're looking for. All right, so with those things in place, what we want to do is start to add our functionality for deleting and updating these to-dos. So to do this, since we want to be able to delete a to-do and then basically refresh all the information that is in our to-do list and have that be shown, we get into this potential concept of either prop drilling or sending notifications up to higher components. And really what this is better solved with is using the context API in React. And the context API allows us to inject different pieces of data at any point into our application. So what we're going to do is we're going to, in our index.js, let me close out some of these extra tabs in here that we don't need right now. So inside of our index.js, we're getting these initial to-dos. We want to go ahead and store those in some sort of state, but we want to have them in a centralized state that we can access in different components. So we're going to take these initial to-dos and then we're going to save them in a piece of context. So let's go ahead and look at what that looks like. Let's create a folder for context. And I think we'll only have one context, but we can still split it out this way. And this will be the to-dos context.js. And so what we'll do is we will import the create context and use state from React. And we'll go ahead and create that context. So we'll say to-dos context equals create context. So there that thing is. And then we're going to create a provider. So to-dos provider is going to take in some properties, one of them that will destructure as children. And then it's going to return something. And really what we want to return in here is the pieces of information that we want to be accessible inside of the rest of our provider. So what we'll return is the to-dos context.provider. Now the provider is the thing that will actually provide values to the rest of our application. And if you're new to React context, it might be good to take a little bit of time to kind of walk through and see what this thing is all about. We'll try to explain the details here, but you might need to do some extra reading. So we're returning this provider in here. Let me see if I can get some automatic formatting. There we go. So we're returning this provider component that then returns these children. But the thing we need is this provider needs to have an initial value. So it needs to have some sort of object as the initial value. And what we'll do, we'll go ahead and define what it is we want to return, and then we'll go ahead and create those things. So we want to return the to-dos. So those are all the to-dos that we're working with in the application. We want to return a function called setToDo so that we can set those to-dos. Then we want to refresh to-dos. We want to update to-do. We want to delete a to-do, and we want to add a to-do. So those are all the things that we want in here to be able to access in other places in our application. And lastly, we will export both of these things. So we'll export the provider and the context. All right, so we've got kind of the structure here settled or filled in. Now we need to actually create all of these functions and then this property. So we mentioned that we're going to pull in use state above, and what we'll do is use that inside of here. So we'll say const to-dos, and then set to-dos. So this is your basic use state in React. Go ahead and stub that out. And now we can call our refresh, or go ahead and create our refresh to-dos, which is going to be an async function. And it's going to make a fetch request to our API. So I like to go ahead and stub these out with a try catch, and we'll log out that error if there is one. And then I use the built-in fetch API. So we'll say const res equals await fetch /API /get to-dos. Now notice this is the same URL that we worked with earlier. This is a relative path to our API endpoint. We did this earlier in Postman, or actually in the browser for the get. And then we'll say the const latest to-dos equals await res.json. And then since we've got our to-do state, we'll call the set to-dos. So set to-dos with those latest to-dos. All right. So there's a function to be able to refresh to-dos. Now we want to create one to be able to add a to-do. So const add to-do, an async function that takes in a to-do. And this is going to look very similar to what we did up here. So let's actually just copy this and paste it down here. And we will send this request to create to do. But in this case, it's now going to be a post request. So we'll need to define that as a post request. Then we'll need to define a body. And this is going to be a stringified version of an object that has a property of description. And actually, let's just go ahead and call this thing description up here. So now we're passing the object that has a key of description and a value of description to our create to do. And if we look at that function, notice that this thing takes in that description on the body. So that should work out well. And the last thing we can make sure we do is set the headers, and that's going to be an object, and we'll set the content type to application/JSON. And when we send that request, we will get back a response. Then we'll get back the data, which is the new to-do. And what we want to do is now update our to-dos by adding in the latest to-do. So we'll call our set to-dos. And since we want to add it to the to-dos that are already being tracked inside of our state, we'll grab a reference to our previous to-dos. And then we'll just return a new array that has the new to-do in it. So we'll return an array that has the new to-do at the beginning, and then the previous to-dos at the end. So this will add that new to-do at the very beginning. And that seems to be all we need to do inside of our add to-do. All right, so we have our fetch, we have our add. Now we need an update. And again, this will look pretty similar to what we had before. So let's copy this, and let's say this is going to be update to do. And I'm going to call this thing the updated to-do. So this is the thing that we're looking to now. It's the updated version of the to-do. It has the same ID. And this is the thing that we actually want to save inside of Airtable. So we'll call the update to-do endpoint. This will be a put instead of a post. So there's our put. And then we will stringify this updated to-do. Same headers there. And then we'll say that this updated to-do that we've already got up here, we don't actually need to get the data back from this. We just need to make sure that this thing happened appropriately. So now we can, similar to above, we can set the to-dos based on the previous to-do. So we want to grab the to-do with the same ID. So whatever this to-do is, we want to grab the to-do that's in state already with that ID and override its fields with the fields of the newer one here. So this might seem a little bit tricky, but let's go ahead and try to do that. So we'll start with grabbing the existing to-dos, and we'll do that by spreading out the previous to-dos. So this will just give us a fresh copy of those. And then we'll grab the existing to-do, and this is existing to-dos.find, and we're trying to find the specific one that matches the ID of this updated to-do. So for a given to-do, we want the one where its ID is equal to the updated to-do.id. And when we get that thing, now we want to update the fields of that existing to-do to match the updated to-do.fields. All right, so we've already kind of executed this stuff inside of Airtable. Now we're just updating what's in memory. And at the end of this, we want to return the existing to-dos, and that should update our state appropriately. So what this will help do is when we call either an update or a create or a delete, we can still access the data after we are updating it here, the update, the to-do state up here. We don't have to do any extra work to have this thing basically get figured out how to display those. And we'll see that here in a second. So I'm going to copy in the last one here of delete to do. Copy this in just to make it a little bit easier and we can move on. But it's similar. We're taking in an ID and we make a fetch request, a delete request to our delete to do endpoint. We are passing in the ID. And then after that happens successfully, now we're updating the to-dos by filtering out the one that we just deleted. All right, so that was kind of a lot, but this to-dos context will really make it easier for us in the future to be able to reuse the to-do state in different places in our application. So we have this to-dos context ready. Now we need to actually use it. And the way we use it is inside of our app.js. First, we need to import the to-dos provider, and we will import this from the context / to-dos context. And then to make it accessible inside of here, we need to wrap all of those things with this to-dos provider. So here's our to-dos provider, and we just want to wrap all of that stuff there. All right, so now this means that inside of our index.js, we will have the ability to get a reference to that to-dos context and then grab the to-do items from it. So what this looks like is we will import our to-dos context from, and then we'll go back to the context folder again with the to-dos context. So we'll import that thing, and then we'll grab the React function, or two React functions. So we'll import the use effect and the use context from React. And then now let's get a reference to those to-dos. So we'll say, we'll grab the to-dos and the set to-dos, and then use context of to-dos context. So we're using this to-dos context, and then we're basically getting access to it or the things inside of it by calling the use context hook, which is built into React. So this is maybe new to you, so you can look up use context inside of React. But it basically gives us access to the properties that are inside of this context. And notice that inside of this context file, these are all the things that we have access to. And the first two that we're referencing in here is we're saying, I want to grab the to-dos and the set to-dos from this context. And now the last thing we want to do, or two more things we want to do in this file, is since we're grabbing these initial to-dos and then we want to keep those in memory inside of state, inside of our context, we need to go ahead and copy over those initial to-dos to the to-dos that are tracked in this context. This way we can reference those inside of other components. So this is where our use effect comes into play. And a use effect is basically just a hook to be able to trigger when you want a piece of code to run. So if you pass in an empty array, this basically says, I want whatever's in this function to run when this component is first created, and that's it. So what we'll do is when this component is created, we will call set to-dos with our initial to-dos. So the ones that come in from our get server side props, we will go ahead and set them inside of our context by calling the set to-dos here. And then lastly, since we're tracking these things now inside of to-dos, since we set them, now we should be able to use them. So we can say now instead of our initial to-dos, we'll use the actual ones that are inside of that state. And then we can do a little bit of checking in here to make sure that we only display these or only try to display them if to-dos are actually available. So it'll look something like this. If those to-dos are there, then we'll go ahead and try to map and display them. So let's hope if we refresh this, all we should see now is that this stuff is still viable. So we still see all of this stuff right there. Got an error in here on our input type, and we will update that in a second. So now that we have all of this context stuff set up, and again, that might be a little bit tricky and understandably so, but it's going to be really useful for us when we come in back to this to-do file. Because now what we want to do is handle the ability to update one of those to-dos. So let's create a function called const toggle or handle toggle completed. So if we toggle one of those to-dos completed or not, this is going to be an async function. And actually, it doesn't need to be. We can actually just mark this as a regular function. But what we want to do is say we want to grab the updated fields. And this is going to be an object where it's going to take the existing fields, make a copy of them. So we'll use the spread operator there. We'll copy them in. And then we want to override the completed property with the opposite of what it was before. So this will be todo.fields.completed. So we'll copy in all of the original fields, then we'll flip the completed field. And now we can say const updated to do equals the ID is going to come from the to do ID. And then the fields is going to be the updated fields. And with that thing, now with this context function here, the update to do, now we can call that thing. So we could say call update to do with this updated to do. Now we still need to import this thing. So we'll need to import the to do's context. And this will come from that same file we were just looking at. And then lastly, we'll also want to import the use context function or hook inside of React as well. So now, similar to how we did in the index file, we want to grab only the properties or functions that we care about. So we're actually going to grab the update to do and the delete to do functions from use context of this to do's context. Now, again, the very powerful aspect of using the context API is now that these functions are part of this context, we can access this context inside of any functional component that we want in React. And that data will now be centralized to come through. Anytime we update it, it will be updated inside of this index.js file, which then means it will get updated when it comes through here, and it will kind of keep our data transformations pretty simple. All right, so what we want to do is inside of our input, we want to say on change. And with this, we want to call the handle toggle completed function. And then for our delete button, we want to have an on click. And this thing will call the delete to do function and pass in the to do ID. So with this one, it's just going to call this delete to do function directly here. It looks like we've got a typo here. This should be update to do instead of updated to do. All right, so let's give this a shot. We wrote a lot of code. Now let's see if this is going to potentially work. Let's make sure that that error went away. And the reason that was there is because we didn't have the ability to update whether or not that thing was checked until we added the update to do functionality. So hopefully what will happen is we'll be able to click this checkbox and it will go and update that thing and we'll see it without the strike through. So we click this and looks like we get an error in here. And looking back at the code, there's a little typo in here where this content type should actually be a dash. And then I think we'll have to fix this 2 more times. So in the create, the update, and the delete, we want to make sure that is just a dash. So now we'll save that and we'll come back over to our application. Now, if we try to give this a try, we'll go ahead and click the checkbox here and you see that that actually updated. So to do or test to do number 3 should now be not completed. So that looks right. And then if we do this again, this should now be deleted or excuse me, completed. And now we see it inside of Airtable is completed. Now the last check-in here is to try to delete this thing. So now 3 went away and we can see that inside of Airtable as well. So we've got our CRUD functionality working with our to-dos inside of Next.js. Now it's time to start working on authentication in our application. So in the next video, we'll look at integrating Auth0 for authentication into our Next.js app.